On today's show, Ja Morant trade rumors out of seemingly nowhere. What would it take for the Houston Rockets to land the superstar guard? Plus the future of the point guard position, Fred VanVleet's possible contract extension, and so much more. It's all coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Thursdays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets, where the best way you can help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Make sure to drop us a comment while you're there. What would you be willing to trade to see Ja Morant wearing a Houston Rockets jersey? We're going to talk about that and a bunch more here in just one moment. First, I want to let you know today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just head on over to FanDuel.com. And as always, thanks so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you so much for being an everydayer. We're going to talk about these Ja Morant trade rumors that seemingly popped up out of nowhere. How reliable they are, you take with a grain of salt. However, the fact that we did just see Luka Doncic dealt to the Lakers means that you take everything, even if there's only a teensy tiny little bit of smoke, you take it all pretty seriously at this point in time. We'll also talk about the overall future of the point guard position, or I guess the lead guard position for this Houston Rockets team, and as that relates to Fred VanVleet, any possible contract extension for him, Reed Sheppard's future with the team, or any other outside target for the Rockets to potentially consider down the line. Let's start with these Ja Morant rumors that seemingly popped up out of nowhere, and it started with the Ringer's Howard Beck, good friend of the program, good friend of Locked On, basically saying that you should keep an eye on Ja Morant, that you know, around the trade deadline, I'm paraphrasing here, but he asks around and he talks to certain GMs about, you know, we know all the names that we, you know, were rumored or reported to be, you know, on the trading block around the deadline, but he likes to touch base on what are some of the names that we didn't hear. And Ja Morant was surprisingly a name that popped up. And it's weird, right? Like, why would the Grizzlies look into trading Ja Morant? So before I venture any further into this, I will say that the Grizzlies GM, Zach Kleiman, came out and issued a statement and where he said, I can't blame other executives for fantasizing about us trading Ja, but it's just that, fantasy. We are not trading Ja, continue to underestimate Ja, this team, and this city, and we will let our performance on the floor speak for itself. I'm not going to give this nonsense further oxygen and look forward to getting back to basketball. Very strong statement from Grizzlies GM Zach Kleiman. And under normal circumstances, I'd be inclined to believe him. However, we did just see Nico Harrison and the Mavs deal Luka Doncic, which might be like that may be the outlier, right? However, we also saw Pat Riley earlier this season say that the Miami Heat were not dealing Jimmy Butler. And if you really want to rewind the clock and go from a more personal angle, you can go to all those years ago where Daryl Morey said that he was not trading Chris Paul. And then what did he do a couple months later? He traded Chris Paul for Russell Westbrook. So it's not unheard of for a GM to take an outward public stance against trading one of their players and then turn around and do exactly that in the offseason. Now, I will say that one thing that is interesting here about this Ja Morant situation is you've got to try and figure out what would the motivations be behind trading Ja. Now, this Grizzlies team has experienced a decent bit of success despite at times not having Ja Morant in the lineup. So is there a version of this Grizzlies team that thinks that they could be better utilized, better service, better, more dangerous without Ja, if they could get back other pieces to shore up other spots in the lineup, or a better, more complementary piece than what Ja provides to, Triple J and Desmond Bane? Who knows? Who knows what the Grizzlies thinking here is? But one element that I do think is worth considering here, and this is similar to the Luka stuff, however much you agree or disagree with Nico Harrison's approach to Luka, the conditioning, the fat shaming, all that, and and kind of the locker room mentality that Luka had towards all of that. It's worth noting at least that when the whole Ja Morant stuff was happening in Memphis with the suspensions and all that, and we'll call it immaturity for lack of better terminology, that the two players in the Grizzlies locker room that were really very outwardly against kind of that behavior and didn't appreciate kind of the dynamics of that locker room were Dillon Brooks and Steven Adams. The two of kind of older, more veteran voices on that Grizzlies squad. And I do wonder how heavily that and some of the off the court antics and stuff are potentially playing into Ja's potential future in Memphis. Now, he's seemingly been on the straight and narrow for a minute now, but maybe all that stuff kind of rubbed, some people the wrong way inside the organization. Maybe they're a little averse to giving him his next big contract extension whenever it does ultimately come around. He's a ways off from it. He's on the books through 2027, 2028. So it's not like he's, in line for a Supermax extension tomorrow or anything, but there could be 1,000,001 different reasons for why the Grizzlies might want to move on from Ja Morant. Maybe it's Ja himself. Maybe Ja doesn't want to be in Memphis anymore. Maybe he doesn't appreciate the city. Maybe he wants to be in a different environment. Maybe he's got some beef with his teammates. Who knows? And at the end of the day, we're in the player empowerment era where all it takes is a player to say, get me out of here, or I want to go to XYZ destinations or whatever. And it removes almost all, if not all, the leverage from the team that the player is currently playing for. And then they have to wind up dealing them for pennies on the dollar. So as it currently stands, however unlikely it might be that the Grizzlies do ultimately trade Ja Morant, I don't think of Howard Beck as just a guy who's going to go out there and spread gossip. If he heard it from an executive or two, or as far as Ja being a name to keep an eye out for, that could be a very realistic trade target for the Rockets as early as this upcoming offseason. You think about the Rockets' needs so far with this team. They need a legit bona fide go-to scorer, somebody that they can put the ball in the hands of a certain guy down the stretch of a game and allow them to take over any given contest. And that's exactly what Ja Morant can provide. He is an insane downhill presence. He's really improved his outside shooting as well. And he's a legit superstar. He is. Ja Morant is a legit superstar with an insane ceiling. He's still only 25 years old. And yeah, it'd be absolutely bonkers if the Grizzlies decided that they wanted to get rid of him. But what would it cost if the Houston Rockets were to enter those trade discussions? If Ja Morant did hit the market for whatever reason this upcoming offseason, what would it take for the Houston Rockets to get involved? Should the Houston Rockets get involved in any potential Ja Morant sweepstakes? We're going to take a look at what a trade package would have to be from the Rockets coming up here in just a moment, as well as getting to the overall future of the point guard position for this Houston Rockets team. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. Using FanDuel's live betting feature is so easy, and it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether you're backing your team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three, you never feel like you missed out on your chance to get in on the action. Plus, the app is so easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, let's take a look at what an actual trade would have to probably look like if you're the Houston Rockets and you enter into a hypothetical Ja Morant sweepstakes as early as this offseason. Now, again, trying to figure out what the motivations would be behind a Ja Morant trade would be kind of the biggest piece of the puzzle to try and figure. Assuming that the Grizzlies want to stay competitive. One angle that I could consider here is the fact that the Grizzlies, one of their biggest hurdles to success this season has been the fact that they turn the ball over a ton. They are a turnover machine. They're one of the worst teams in the entire association at turning the basketball over. How much of the Grizzlies' identity could you keep if you were to slide Fred VanVleet in place of Ja Morant? And I'm not saying you do a 1-for-1 trade. There's not nearly Fred is not that kind of player, but at least from a hypothetical trade standpoint, Ja's making $39.4 million. Fred, if the Rockets were to pick up his team option for next season, would be making $44.8 million. Those contracts are at least close enough to each other that if the Grizzlies wanted to stay competitive, if they wanted to maintain their standing as one of the top teams in the Western Conference without experiencing too big of a drop-off, trading for Fred VanVleet and then some would be probably one of the best moves that they could ultimately make if you were looking at trading Ja Morant and you weren't going to get back a true blue superstar in return as well. And I can't think of another star that would necessarily fit the Grizzlies better than Ja at this very moment. So again, maybe some of it is cost motivated, maybe some of it is locker room motivated, who knows? But if you were to entertain a package of Fred VanVleet plus somebody for Ja Morant, unfortunately, from a Rockets perspective, it feels like if you're trading for a guy like Ja Morant, who is a bona fide star, a bona fide superstar in today's NBA, capable of being the best player on a team that, wants to make deep postseason runs, all that, you're probably going to have to give up one of your two best players. That's just the reality of the situation. And at this stage, when I say two best players, I'm talking not only current playing ability, but also ceiling ability and kind of what we've seen out of these guys so far. And so the two names that I'm speaking of right here are both Alperen Sengun and Amen Thompson. It's not necessarily a slight to Jalen Green. It's just, as far as things stand right now, based on current playing ability and also ceiling ability and kind of what we've seen through their careers so far, I think that Jalen Green has had his ebbing and flowing and TBD on how the rest of this season ultimately plays out. But I don't necessarily think that another team would view him as the same level of cornerstone piece that they could get back in a trade as they would Sengun or Amen Thompson. And so the question then becomes, is Ja Morant worth giving up either of those two names? Is Ja Morant worth giving up Alperen Sengun? Is Ja Morant worth giving up Amen Thompson? How good do you think those guys can ultimately become in order to potentially, thinking about, would you give either of them up for an established star player right now? I very much lean no. I very much lean that I wouldn't give up either of those two guys, especially when you also consider that you'd have to give up, more than likely, have to give up Fred VanVleet to make any version of the salary matching situation kind of work. Things change a little bit if you're using Alperen Sengun because his contract kicks in, or his new extension kicks in this upcoming offseason, where he'll be making just under $34 million. So the salary matching component becomes a little bit easier if LP is one of the pieces going out. But I don't know. I don't think I would do that. It doesn't make sense to me for the Rockets to gut their team of young talent, of the two top end pieces of talent, right? It becomes a little bit different when you start entertaining ideas for, like a Kevin Durant, or like we were doing earlier this season, a De'Aaron Fox, right? If you're not giving up either of the two most valuable pieces of the rebuild so far with Sengun and Amen Thompson, if you start getting into the secondary tier of guys, the Jalens, the Jabaris, Tari, further down, Cam Whitmore, Reed Sheppard, then it becomes a little bit more palatable to understand, okay, you got to give up some value, you got to give up a prospect with a high ceiling, with a bright future, whatever, and some draft capital to get an established win now piece, or a win now player, or a star level player. But for the Grizzlies to make a Ja Morant trade even remotely worthwhile, they would need a piece coming back to help them stay competitive in the here and now, which would be Fred VanVleet. And then they would also need a cornerstone type piece to build upon, to pair, to have for the future. And that would be one of Amen Thompson or Alperen Sengun. And again, at this stage, I can't talk myself into a trade of Fred and Alp or Fred and Amen for Ja Morant and I guess filler on top of that to make the contracts kind of match, I think the Rockets would be an inherently worse off basketball team if they were to make that trade. Now, maybe you make that deal. Maybe you are entertaining that deal if you're able to keep Amen Thompson, because thinking about a backcourt duo of Ja Morant and Amen Thompson for the next, 5 to 10 years in Houston sounds incredibly exciting. And those are two guys that should, on paper, be very complementary of each other's skill sets. Amen Thompson be able to make up for some of the defensive limitations of Ja Morant at the end of the day, adding a little bit of size to the backcourt, all that stuff. But two guys who are absolutely insane downhill threats, can get out and run in transition. Rockets would be one of the most high octane teams in the league with just those two guys, and then you put the right pieces around them. But it doesn't feel rooted in reality to be able to make that trade and for the team to be better off for it. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, it feels like Amen and Sengun are both too important to the fabric of this team. And when you look at the future of this Rockets team, it very much feels like the hopes are kind of pinned on Amen Thompson turning into that, or just naturally developing into that star player for this Houston Rockets squad. LP is close to it. LP's already grown into an all-star caliber player. How much better can he ultimately get is another big question facing this squad. But at this point, I don't think there's a reasonable trade offer that makes sense for both sides. I'd be very curious, what trade offers would you put on the table? What would you be willing to give up to get Ja Morant if he became available this offseason, if the Grizzlies were looking to move on from him? Is there a world where you would want to give up one of Amen Thompson or Alperen Sengun for Ja Morant? Would you be willing to go that far? I don't know if I would, but I'm very curious. Your thoughts, let me know in the YouTube comments. Coming up, I do want to talk about the overall future, kind of a big picture look at the future of the Rockets point guard position, Fred VanVleet's role, his possible contract extension, what the numbers would look like there, as well as potentially another target or two, and maybe Reed Sheppard's future as well. We'll kind of look at it. We'll take a holistic view at the point guard spot of the roster. We're going to get there in just one moment. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, zooming out a little bit, and first off, wanted to just tackle the Ja Morant rumors because I'd seen it being discussed in various places, and at least it was worthwhile to bring up just from the standpoint of, is it realistic? And not only is it maybe not realistic because it feels like the Grizzlies wouldn't let go of Ja at all, but again, you could have said the same thing for Luka 3 weeks ago. But it also just doesn't feel realistic at this point from a Rockets perspective because it doesn't feel like they have a trade package on the table that the Grizzlies would want. Again, you'd assume they want to stay at least some level of competitive in the here and now, but also acquiring a future franchise cornerstone, a young player that has true star upside potential if they want like a little bit of, I guess, a timeline reset, so to speak, in Memphis. So I think from that perspective, the Rockets would be hesitant to deal one of Amen Thompson or Alperen Sengun. If you had to pick between the two of them, I think that if you were hell-bent on making that trade happen, I think you could deal LP, as disappointing as that would sound. And I'm sure there's many Turkish fans listening to this and be like, okay, Jackson, you hate LP. Not the case whatsoever, but it is a guard-driven league, right? And because Ja Morant's already an established star, maybe that's enough of a push where the Rockets think they really need to go all in and kind of, sell high on LP's all-star caliber season to get themselves a true star level player, a superstar level player. And maybe it's just enough for them to want to be able to pair a Ja Morant with an Amen Thompson, plus the other ancillary pieces that the Rockets have, Jabari, Tari, whatever's left over after the trade. And you could talk me into a version of that Rockets team that is very different from this current version, plays a more high-octane style, gets out and runs a lot more in transition, plays through their athletes quite a bit more. But we've also seen this team when they don't have LP as that connective tissue piece in the half court, and things look awful. So I don't know. I'm on the fence, but I don't think it makes sense. But the issue at large here is that the Rockets do need an answer for their long-term point guard position, or just whoever their primarily ball handler is going to be down the line. And I'm jury's still out on whether or not that can be Amen Thompson. We've seen him getting more primary ball handler reps this season. He's being used on ball quite a bit more to initiate offense and to attack and all that stuff. But is he ever going to be the guy that you want being your table setter 24/7 offensively? Probably not, because at the end of the day, that also robs him of his very unique skill set where he can be played all around the court, right? Where he can be used as a screener, you can be used out of the dunker spot, you can use him as a cutter out of the corners, you can use him with the ball in his hands. There's so many different ways that you can use him in Thompson. But if he has to be your initiator and your primary ball handler, then you kind of take away those other elements of his game that make him so dangerous. So the Rockets are kind of not necessarily at a crossroads, but it is interesting what the future of that position is going to look like. Fred is essentially on the final year of his deal. He's got a team option for next season worth $44.8 million. And in all likelihood, the Rockets are probably going to decline that team option and renegotiate a much more team-friendly contract, very similar to what the Minnesota Timberwolves did with Rudy Gobert last season, before the season started, I think, where Gobert declined a $46.6 million player option and then signed a 3-year, $110 million contract that carries him through the 27-28 season. Could very easily see, and we've talked about this on the show before. If you're an everydayer, you already know what's up. The Rockets are more than likely going to decline Fred's option and renegotiate a team-friendly contract for him, because it's understood that he was overpaid quite a bit when he first came to Houston. So what would a team-friendly contract look like for Fred VanVleet? Something along the lines of 3 years, $100 million, 4 years, $100 million, maybe like somewhere in that $25 to $35 million a year range seems like the sweet spot for Fred and for his services. But the question mark kind of then becomes, this team very clearly needs Fred VanVleet to succeed. There's a reason that the team has bottomed out as hard as they have over the last few weeks leading up to All-Star break, because they haven't had Fred VanVleet in the lineup. He is so important to the fabric of this team, to the identity of this team, to the success of this team offensively, making sure guys get in the right spot. And look, I know there's a weird subsection of Rockets fans that are like completely fed up with Fred VanVleet. And if you still are, even after seeing the 6-game losing streak and even after seeing the other losses on top of that before the All-Star break hit, I don't know what else to tell you. Fred VanVleet is very important to the success of this Rockets team, but it's not specifically Fred that's important to the team. It's Fred's skill set that nobody else on this roster has or can replicate at this current juncture. So that begs the question, can the Rockets be in a position to replace Fred VanVleet as early as potentially this offseason, or are they going to be on the hook for renegotiating his contract and relying on Fred VanVleet, possibly to the point of over-reliance over these next few years? The hope was, I believe, as early as last season, for Jalen Green to be able to grow and develop into that lead guard, that primary initiator for the offense. And there's some nights that he looks capable of doing it, and there's some nights where he looks comfortable and he can run the show and it looks fantastic. Then there's other nights where it looks awful, where the turnovers start racking up and, guys aren't getting involved. We have games where Alperen Sengun only gets one shot attempt in the fourth quarter because Jalen and Amen can't get him the basketball, on the short roll or in the pick and roll, getting downhill towards the basket, all these different issues, right? So how do the Rockets address this? The easiest, simplest answer is you just hold on to Fred. You renegotiate his contract and he's your long-term point guard. But Fred is going to be turning 30 late in about a month, and he's going to be an undersized guard on the wrong side of 30. And at the end of the day, Fred is not the lead guard that you want taking 15, 20 shot attempts a game. He's not the all-star guard that you would ideally like to pair with Alperen Sengun to really get the best out of both of them, right? Like ideally you need a running mate for Alp, a dynamic all-star caliber guard to really unlock his true ceiling and to unlock the Rockets' true ceiling. When Jalen Green looks like an all-star when he's playing out of his mind, and you're able to pair that with Alperen Sengun when he's playing to the best of his ability, they look like one of the best dynamic duos in the entire NBA. But Jalen to this point hasn't been consistent enough, and Alp's also had his issues this year, right? The finishing around the basket, the efficiency hit that he's taken with his game, like neither of those guys have played their best version of basketball together consistently enough, and it does beg the question a little bit, can those two guys be successful with one another? I still think that they can, but I also don't completely knock people who maybe see things differently and think that it's going to come down to one or the other between Sengun and Jalen, because Jalen's outside shooting isn't nearly consistent enough. Do you have, is Jalen get the right pick and roll partner for LP down the line? Jalen needs the ball in his hands to get rhythm. So does LP. At some point, the Rockets might be forced to ultimately make a decision there. But the Rockets very clearly drafted Reed Sheppard as what they hope to be, the long-term potential point guard of the future. His skill set is Fred VanVleet light, or a poor man's Fred VanVleet, at least on paper. The three-point shooting hasn't translated yet, but that's one down-the-line option. However, we have very little data on Reed so far, and what we do have has been, unfortunately, pretty disappointing up to this point. So I wouldn't hang my hat on Reed Sheppard developing into a starting caliber point guard overnight all of a sudden. Maybe he, just needs the offseason. Maybe you get the rookie year jitters out of the way, and then he comes into training camp next year, and he looks incredible. But again, I wouldn't be banking on that. And at this point, I don't even think the Rockets are banking on it. So then the question becomes, what could you do to remedy that situation with an outside component, right? Could you trade for the future lead guard of this Rockets team? We just talked about Ja Morant and what you would essentially probably have to give up to get a guy of Ja Morant's caliber. Another guy that could be available on the trade market, and this is such an interesting name to me, and there were a lot of Rockets fans who were fantasizing about this possibility during the All-Star game, but Trae Young is a name that's really intriguing. And I genuinely don't know what the Hawks are doing, because it felt like the Hawks had kind of developed this cool identity, and they had, DeAndre Hunter and Bogdanovich coming off the bench, and they had one of the best benches in the NBA with Okongwu coming off too, and they kind of retooled their roster. They got younger, they got more athletic around Trae, and they had this kind of new defensive-minded identity this season with Dyson Daniels, wrecking shop the way that he has been. But I don't really know, is Trae Young in the Hawks' future? Legitimately, or are the Hawks potentially going to look to trade Trae Young in the next year or two because they feel like they can't win with him as, the heliocentric star player that he is? I don't know. I mean, I feel like Trae Young has been in trade rumors for the past few seasons now, and even though he is Atlanta Hawks basketball at this point, has been their franchise guy for a few years now, for more than a few years now, basically ever since getting drafted, right? He became their franchise guy. I just don't know, let me rephrase. Imagining Trae Young in the Rockets starting point guard spot and pairing him with a guy like Alperen Sengun, the way that those two guys would complement each other with Trae's shooting, with his playmaking ability, his ability to get everybody on the court involved, the NBA's assist leader right now, if I'm not mistaken, at this point in time, it's very tantalizing to think about. And maybe there are other options out there that aren't, true star level starting point guard players, but I mean, it's hard not to get excited about the idea of a Trae Young possibility in a Houston Rockets jersey if he were to become available this upcoming offseason. That's also one of the names that, if the Grizzlies were looking to get rid of Ja Morant, a Ja Morant Trae Young swap could be really interesting for both parties at the end of the day. Seeing Trae Young in a Grizzlies jersey with the identity and things that they've built over there in Memphis would be really intriguing, to say the least. But I say all this, and I looking at kind of the future of the Rockets point guard position, that is kind of a major uncertainty for this squad. Is, the immediate here and now answer is you have Fred VanVleet, you just renegotiate his deal, and that's all she wrote, right? But it does feel like at times this Rockets team is overly reliant on what Fred VanVleet provides, and if all you're doing is committing to kind of a Band-Aid fix by re-signing him and keeping him as your starting point guard moving down the line, then at some point you're going to have to address that position. At some point you need somebody to be able to step up and fill the void, whether that be internally, like Amen Thompson or Reed Sheppard growing and developing into that lead guard role. I don't know if it's going to be Jalen Green at this stage. Maybe it's still too soon to write him off as a true lead guard candidate, but just don't know if we see enough consistent playmaking ability when he does have the ball in his hands, as well as ball security, things like that. And then, if it's not an internal candidate, then you're going to have to trade for one, because that's kind of the recipe for success that we've seen this season. When the Rockets are at their best, It's when Alperen Sengun has one of Jalen Green or Fred VanVleet playing like an all-star caliber guard. When neither of those guys are able to step up to the plate and play like an all-star, the Rockets look bad because they don't have that dynamic guard presence to pair with LP offensively to make them unpredictable, to keep opposing teams on their toes defensively. Because if all you have to do is load up on LP, whether it's on the roll, on the short roll, or when he's posting up or facing up, if that's all you have to do to stop the Rockets offense because the other guys, Fred, Jalen, aren't able to show up for XYZ reason, then this team is incredibly one-dimensional at that point. So I do wonder what it would take for the Rockets to get their hands on any number of the available star kind of guards out there in the NBA. Ja, Trey. We've fantasized a lot about De'Aaron Fox earlier this season, but the solution is clear. They need a star caliber guard down the line. And at this point, you're just going to play out the rest of the season and see how it looks, and you'll have to address things in the offseason. But it's interesting to think about some of the different names that could become available down the line. Ja, Trey, any potential other. Give me a shout out for Ant Edwards. My goodness. Give up everything on the roster minus Amen Thompson for a guy like Ant Edwards. TBH. But with that, I'd be curious your thoughts. What would you like to see the Houston Rockets do? Are either of Ja Morant or Trae Young worth pursuing this offseason for the Houston Rockets? How confident are you in one of Amen Thompson or Reed Sheppard growing into that eventual point guard role or lead guard role for this Houston Rockets team? Let me know your thoughts in the YouTube comments. Remember, the best way you can help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Drop the comments while you're there. Subscribe to our daily Locked On Rockets newsletter. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.